Now today I want to talk about the public building in Athens from the advent of the radical democracy in 461 down to the start of the Peloponnesian War in 431. And we see a series of enormous projects, the most notable of which is the Parthenon, that completely really transform the monumental topography of the city of Athens. Now, one question that maybe we should ask is, why now a sudden explosion of buildings? I think this building program is probably linked to the new radical democracy. It's actually closely associated with the most important figure of the radical democracy, Pericles. And there are some reasons why it might be an empowered demos that wants a big building program. First off, the demos is increasingly confident in its own power and its own ability to control the policy in Athens and its ability to engage in imperial activities across the Eastern Mediterranean. And to a degree, we see that confidence also embodied by the erection of these extraordinary monuments, be it the long walls, the propylon, or the Parthenon itself. Furthermore, public works projects are actually just good for the demos economically. When you are building a huge building, you need people who work in quarries, people who are expert architects and stoneworkers and craftsmen and painters. Now, some of these figures are going to be medics, some of them are going to be enslaved people, although those enslaved peoples are likely owned by Athenian citizens who make money when they contract out their slaves, and many of them will simply be free citizens. So in some ways, this public spending economically benefits a significant chunk of the demos. And I would say that those two factors are quite closely aligned. There's plenty of people who will benefit from these projects, but all Athenian citizens, as they see these big monuments, these arguments in stone, will sort of have reason to have their self-esteem increase. They know that they, as voters and citizens and hoplites and rowers, are part of this big imperial project, a project that they now see monumentalized in various ways. Now, perhaps the most important of these big building projects are the long walls. And these have extraordinary geostrategic importance, as well as also quite likely having an ideological aspect. So the long walls connect the Astu of Athens, and then they run roughly 10 miles down to the Piraeus, and it's a double set of walls. And so what these effectively do is make Athens a kind of almost fortified island. These walls had been built during the 150s, during this period of conflict with Corinth and Sparta and Thebes, when clearly there were worries of what a marauding hoplite army could do if it entered Attica. And indeed, a Spartan army does briefly enter Attica during the so-called First Peloponnesian War. So with these long walls, the city of Athens therefore has a fortified route to its main port, the Piraeus, and that means that even if there's an enemy army marauding around Attica, supplies can still be brought into the city by simply being taken by sea, which is dominated by the Athenian navy, landed in the Piraeus, and then they can just be carted up the safe space in between the long walls. So this is quite important. It in a way is an insurance policy against Athens being invaded by a strong hoplite army. And again, both Boeotia and Sparta have very strong hoplite armies. And of course, it also plays to Athens' strength in that it has unquestioned dominance at the sea. The Athenian thalassocracy is closely associated with the Athenian democracy because it's the rowers who man the common rowers, the thetes who man the Athenian fleet. And in some ways, once you run these massive fortifications up from the Piraeus to the Astu at Athens, again, that sort of brings Athens kind of within the fold of the broader Athenian thalassocracy. we do know that these walls are ultimately closely associated with the democracy, and are seen as a kind of, again, argument in stone about the power of the Athenian democracy. So there's a kind of ideological link between, again, the practical geostrategic benefit of having this fortification, and yet it's ideologically associated with the democracy. And as we'll see, these walls are a very, very important part of Pericles' strategy in the opening phases of the Peloponnesian War. So these walls are built over the course of the 450s. They're completed probably in the early 440s. And again, this really radically kind of changes at the geostrategic orientation of Attica. It's now, again, this kind of fortified island that now abuts the Aegean, dominated by the Athenian fleet. Now, our next big project, which is going to be initiated in the probably early 440s, is perhaps the most famous, and that is the Parthenon. Now, the Parthenon is a temple to Athena the Virgin, a Parthenos. It is built on the Acropolis, which of course is the sort of just landmark that dominates the skyline. Also, traditionally one of the most important aspects, central aspects of the city. But during the Persian Wars, the Persians had trashed the Acropolis. They'd wrecked statues, they'd torn down temples. It seems that some of the rubble is taken off for fill. And it seems that much of that space is actually left blank. It's possible that the Athenians deliberately leave the kind of ruined foundations as a sort of memorial to the war. So, for example, if you go to the English town of Coventry, you can see a cathedral that was bombed by the Germans, and they've actually left the cathedral unroofed as basically a war memorial. Look what those Germans did. It's possible that there are big swaths of the Acropolis that up until into the 450s and 440s has actually deliberately been either open or even in ruins as a kind of memorial to the war. Look what those nasty Persians did, destroying our temples here. Now, it is also possible that one reason why there is a renewed willingness to build is the fact that after 449, the Peace of Calais, if it did indeed happen that year, has mended fences with the Persians, or at least reduced the urgency of perhaps memorializing the Persian destruction in 480 and 479. So the Parthenon is going to be, again, really one of the central buildings. It's an extraordinarily large Doric temple in the Doric order. In many ways, it's kind of the most magnificent of all of the Doric temples in Greece. It is going to have a series of reliefs, either in the metopes around the temple or in the interior friezes, that will be ideologically charged, although to this day, art historians still argue about the exact nature of these friezes. And of course, one problem is the Parthenon has had quite a history since classical Athens. It suffered from a bad fire in late antiquity. During the Ottoman period, it was occupied by the Ottoman Turks, who used it as an arsenal. One night, there was a sort of battle between the Venetians and the Ottomans lobbed an incendiary bomb which blew up the gunpowder stores in the Parthenon, which is one reason the Parthenon doesn't have a roof. That caused a degree of damage. And then notoriously, in the 19th century, the British aristocrat Lord Elgin received permission from the Ottoman Sultan to remove a number of the reliefs. These are the so-called Elgin marbles. This includes many of the outer metopes as well as some of the other reliefs. And these were taken back and put in the British Museum and are still subject to an extraordinary dispute today. Greece argues that this is their national cultural heritage that was looted by British imperialists. The British, who still have the Elgin marbles, and my guess is will never ever give them up, they argue that Lord Elgin received permission from the sovereign of Greece, which was at that point a province in the Ottoman Empire, and therefore the British Museum still has rights to them. It's actually kind of one of the classic kind of touchstones of who owns what, who owns the past. But suffice it to say, if you are traveling to Britain, you can still see the Parthenon reliefs if you go to the British Museum. Now, these reliefs, on one hand, show mythic scenes, in particular the mythic battle between Lapiths and Centaurs. And the basic myth is there is a wedding of people in Thessaly called Lapiths, and it's a very nice wedding, and then the Centaurs show up, get drunk, and start to trash the whole thing. And then there's subsequently a big fight between Lapiths and Centaurs. So this is actually part of a sort of motif in Greek art, the Kentauromachy. And the Centaur, in terms of ideology, in terms of how this sort of represents just how the Greeks see the world, Centaurs tend to represent aspects of wildness, savagery. They are sort of, yes, they have these human tops, but they're bestial. They drink, they fight. And so therefore this battle between Lapiths and Centaurs sort of represents a war between the forces of order and civilization and the forces of chaos and barbarity. So certainly that is one ideological message of the Parthenon reliefs. We also see various scenes that seem to show civic activities in Athens. Some of these show contests, cavalry contests, various other kind of agones. And it also seems that the reliefs show scenes from the great Panathenaic procession. So that is aspects of the ritual life of Athens. Now that said, there are some interpretations that have been offered that are somewhat more specific. A interpretation that you will still sometimes encounter of particularly the cavalry scenes is that the cavalrymen represent the dead from the Battle of Marathon. And the argument was that an art historian went and said, I'm pretty sure there's 192. We know from Herodotus that 192 men died at Marathon. Ergo, these cavalrymen sort of represent the spirits, or are meant to honor the dead at Marathon. And there was a time when people felt compelled by this. It seems that has fallen out of favor. In part because it takes some creative counting for who's a cavalryman that counts as a cavalryman, or who's someone standing near a horse. So it's unclear if there are actually exactly 192 cavalrymen. And because of the way that you have to fudge the number of cavalrymen, most art historians don't think that this was deliberately a sort of memorial to Marathon. Also, the Parthenon is being completed at this point close to 50 years after the Battle of Marathon. And at this point, there may be actually less impetus to necessarily commemorate that one battle long, long ago. But that said, I think what we can see is that the sort of various scenes do seem to show aspects of civic life, whether it's cavalry processions. These actually could potentially just be linked to the annual kind of parade and inspection of cavalrymen and their horses. Women are prominently featured, again, quite likely part of the great Panathenaic procession. Art historians also argue, is this to celebrate the democracy? Is this aristocratic? I mean, cavalrymen are actually the most aristocratic aspect of the Athenian army. If anything, it seems it's just evoking the life of the city. And whether we take that as democratic or aristocratic, it celebrates sort of Athenians coming together to engage in various collective rituals. So that's so there we have the Parthenon, which still today, even after it's been burned down and blown up and occupied by the Nazis in World War II, still remains one of the most prominent features of the Athenian skyline. If you go to Greece, you just walk around the city, and everywhere you look, it looms grandly above you, and is a product of this Periclean building program, mostly built during the 440s. Now, somewhat afterwards, a monumental entrance, the propylon, is constructed, which is essentially what you would go through as you walk up the Acropolis and then enter onto kind of that main plateau, and very much designed to complement the grand Doric architecture of the Parthenon. Now, at roughly the same time, down in the Athenian Agora, which is the Agora is the sort of primary marketplace and civic center of the city of Athens, there is another large Doric temple that is built, and probably is built in some ways to sort of parallel the Parthenon, which is above it and to the south on the Acropolis. They're sort of both roughly oriented in the same direction. They're both big Doric temples, and this temple is the which is on the sort of western edge of the Agora, is the temple of Hephaestus. Although until really kind of the late 20th century, it was often referred to as the Thesion, simply because it was decorated with a number of reliefs that featured scenes from the life of Theseus, the legendary king of Athens. But we do know from inscriptions that it is actually a temple to Hephaestus, the metal worker or the craftsman of the gods. And it is possible that in that area was a neighborhood that was actually used by metal workers. Now, this is another big project that was built over a period of time, possibly around 20 years, but it is erected at about the same time as the Parthenon in roughly the same style, and in some ways seems to be in conversation with the Parthenon there up on the Acropolis. Now, one question we should be asking ourselves as we think about some of these sort of magnificent buildings that are being constructed, in addition to the long walls that are, again, really changing the monumental face of Athens. Who's paying for all of this? Where are the Athenians getting the money to erect these immensely expensive buildings? The Parthenon probably costs over 1,000 talents of silver, which is an extraordinary amount of money. And the basic answer is the allies are paying for this. That after the Athenians have merged the taken the treasury of the Delian League and have moved it to Athens, they seem to be pretty shamelessly spending some of the money, some of the phoros, the tribute that they collect on the allies, on domestic projects to enrich and glorify and beautify the city of Athens. This fact that clearly the Demos of Athens is benefiting from this phoros, the fact that this building program is going into full swing, even though the whole reason for the alliance, a defensive alliance against the Persians, an alliance that would effect a war of liberation against other Greek city-states that were under Persian sway, that whole reason ends, is shattered when the Peace of Callias, again, quite likely takes place in 449. Yet the Athenians are still collecting phoros and are still using a significant chunk of that phoros to engage in these extraordinary building projects which enrich in many instances, Athenian craftsmen, Athenian slave contractors. And the fact that the benefits of the empire are now flowing quite shamelessly to Athens is unquestionably going to cause some allies to question the value of the whole project that is the Athenian Empire. So when we return on Friday, we'll start thinking about the Athenian Empire on the cusp of the Peloponnesian War. See you then.